James Day, public television pioneer and chairman of the CUNY TV Advisory Board, passed away in April 2008. His legacy includes the series Day at Night, which aired for 130 episodes beginning in 1973. The program features interviews with many of the great thinkers and achievers of the 20th century. These 30-year-old programs have been restored. The interviews remain fresh and relevant today, exploring issues that are still important to society. Showing them again is CUNY TV's tribute to Jim and his contributions to public television.
Wallace Stegner is the author of more than a dozen books of fiction and history, which are unmistakably the work of a man whose roots are deeply in the soil of the American West. His respect for nature and his reverence for traditional values are all apiece with his fictional settings and the characters who people them. In 1972, his novel Angle of Repose was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Two of his short stories have won O. Henry Memorial Awards, and his most recent book, The Uneasy Chair, about his friend and fellow Westerner Bernard DeVoto, has been praised by book critics as a model of the biographical form. He's combined a career as a writer with that of a teacher of literature and creative writing. For 25 years, until his retirement 2 years ago, he headed the creative writing program at Stanford University. As befits a man with a deep affection for the land, he's been an ardent and active conservationist all his adult life. Wally, the West has a special meaning for you. One of your critics has said that in the Big Rock Candy Mountain, your novel, he found the formulation of your belief in the idyllic nature of the American West. And he said, not you, he said that, that the West is the home of the American dream. Do you think it is the home of the American dream, or ever was?
Well, I think it was. It may not be now. That dream fades, I suppose, progressively from the East Coast westward.
What is the American dream?
Oh, I'm afraid it's probably a dream I can't fully concur in, though I admire it historically and I find it very exciting. It's essentially a dream of something for nothing, of an improved world, the last hope of man, sort of, to get away from his own nature. And I think it's inevitable that that dream fades. No question it's going to fade. It couldn't possibly last, but it was an exciting time while it really bemused the whole population.
And I suppose what has happened is that those wide open spaces are no longer so wide open. What was available is, to a certain extent, used up.
Oh, I think we approach the period of shortage, yes, of rationing of resources. And there's plenty of land in the West, but of course there isn't anywhere near enough water for the land, so that there's going to be plenty of open space. But the open space may be, to some extent, ruined by our installations on it, as it already is, or by our explorations for uranium and one thing or another. There's hardly a desert that isn't scarred up, and those are fragile places. Still, they'll be open. That's not the problem.
In your book about Bernard DeVoto, you, of course, point out that he is, like yourself, of the West. But you indicate he was somewhat handicapped in his own profession by being from the West. When he was in the East, have you ever experienced the same sort of thing? Do you think that being of the West has handicapped you in any way as a writer?
No, I don't think it's handicapped me. I think it handicapped him partly because he thought it did, because he felt Western, he felt outside, and he wanted to prove himself, as it were, in the intellectual circles that he coveted a place in.
But you haven't coveted the same place in those
I'm not an
intellectual
intellectual, Jim, at all. I don't covet a place in there. I think there is no question that the West, as a home for writers or as a subject for writing, does, at this particular time in history, get somewhat ignored.
Because it's provincial?
I beg your pardon?
Because it's provincial?
No, because I think the critics are provincial.
I see.
I'd make that distinction.
Yes.
There is such a, you almost, on occasion, get forced into being a regional or provincial or parochial Westerner in order to assert your right to exist and to speak, because the vast silence on the other side of the continent is likely to make you a little irritable. Actually, I don't feel like a Westerner in that sense. I feel like an American who happens to be from the West, and I would rather have my own particular bailiwick expand from the West rather than be contracted down into it.
You're not a regional writer in the
I hope not.
narrowest sense of
That's
that.
a limitation that I wouldn't want to put on myself. I think probably people are people in the West as elsewhere. And if they're people of a different kind, it's partly that the American dream has lasted longer in the West, and that there's an openness in this society which probably doesn't exist in other places, and also that the West, because it is mainly arid, is bound to remain more rural than other parts of the country. And it's partly a difference between urban and rural that I'm talking about, as well as geographically west or east.
Once again, in quoting from your book about Bernard DeVoto, you say that you are both historians by the sheer compulsion of the region that shaped us. What was that shaping that caused you to both be historians, amateur historians, you say later, as I recall?
The amateur ones, I think, are the best ones, but don't say that in the company of historians. I think probably it's a product or the function of living and growing up in a country which has no history. I grew up literally without history.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, I didn't know who had been there before me. Living in that case, when I began to be aware of anything, I was living in Saskatchewan in the Cypress Hills, out in the last tail end of the Plains frontier. And I knew nothing about who had been in that country. In fact, very few had. You know, the Indians had left no tracks, no more tracks than the buffalo or the wind. And as a matter of fact, the Indians in the Plains had not been there for very long because they came with the horse, essentially, in that part of the Plains. So that I didn't know anything about what had gone on in the Cypress Hills, and I found myself ultimately, much, much later, trying to be the Herodotus of the Cypress Hills simply because I didn't want to be a man from nowhere.
Well, you were in some contact with history. History simply meant something different to you than...
Nobody taught us our history in school, you see. Nobody taught us anything about our own country. The history we learned in school was all about England's wars or even about the rape of the Sabine women or something. It wasn't anything about the wars between the Blackfeet and the Crees or between Hudson Bay Company and the other kinds of things which had gone into the making of that country. So I had to get it all up by myself, and I found after I had done it that I was almost the first to have done it. I have the kind of unique distinction of having been the Herodotus of a little piece of the American continent. And Wolf Willow is a kind of basic book. It isn't going to be the ultimate book, but it's a kind of basic one because it was almost the first.
And Wolf Willow is also about your own history of growing up in that Middle West. You were born in Iowa, but left Iowa at a very early age, I judge, and went north with your family. Was your father in
Oh, he was
farming?
a drifter.
A drifter?
Yeah. We drifted to lots of places following what has been known as the old Scandinavian migration track through the Northwest. We were on our way to Alaska when I got scarlet fever and stopped that, and we got stalled in Seattle and then came on to Saskatchewan, Montana, back down to Utah.
How were the places chosen? For what purpose were they chosen, I should say?
American dream.
Was it?
Sure. Some kind of get-rich-quick, Big Rock Candy Mountain over the next rise. And in the case of Saskatchewan, it was, of course, right at the beginning of World War I, and all that country was being plowed up, which it shouldn't have been, to grow wheat to feed the armies of Europe. So we helped make a dust bowl, and then we got out.
Well, apparently you didn't, you or your family never really found that great American dream or the pot at the end of the rainbow, because you've said that until you were 12, you never saw a bathtub or a water closet.
That's right. They were not current in Saskatchewan in my time. They are now. No, I never saw a lawn, as a matter of fact, until I was 12 or 13 years old. We moved to Great Falls, Montana, which I thought was a great metropolis and full of gaudy and wonderful things. The Missouri River helped, too, since I'd grown up in dry country. No, the the kind of frontier we were on was a very belated frontier. In Saskatchewan in 1914 to 20 approximately, we were simply reproducing Kansas of the 1860s, almost literally.
Did you feel at the time, as you were growing up, that it was a deprived childhood in
Oh,
any
no.
sense?
Oh, no, no.
Poor as you may have been.
I don't think children feel deprived. They don't notice they're deprived. Once in a while you get hungry, and you're always aware that you're cold in Saskatchewan. But generally you could afford a sheepskin coat, and generally you grew enough or slaughtered a beef or pig or something so that you got through the winter eating. No, I wasn't aware of being deprived at all. As a matter of fact, I was thinking the other day that I suppose I've never been bored in my life, and I attribute that partly to growing up in a place where there wasn't time to be bored. There was always something to do.
How was the time filled? Work?
Oh, no, this was a kind of Huckleberry Finn place to grow up, you know, marvelous place for a child. We all had guns from the time we were 8 or 9 years old. We were out in the brush pretending to be pioneers and shooting grouse and cooking them over a campfire, or eating frogs' legs and things like that, hunting for freshwater pearl.
And knowing very little about the pioneers, I suppose.
Oh, no, and doing our destructive bit just the way the pioneers did.
What about the
Little animals.
What about the schooling, Molly?
Schooling, I think, must have been reasonably good. It was absolutely British. But it went from 8 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon, and it went 10 months a year, which I think must have been good for us. Kept us out of mischief anyway. And it was, insofar as it was an education in reading, writing, and arithmetic, I think it was both thorough and sensible. And you know, I got imprinted with an awful lot of poetry, for instance, before I was in the 5th or 6th grade.
Good poetry?
Good poetry, yeah. Well, good enough for children anyway.
Yeah.
You grow up past the kinds of things that you like at that age. Battle of Lake Regillus or Horatius at the Bridge, you know, that kind of thing. But also a lot of Tom Moore and things like that I can still reproduce, like turning on a switch. So they imprinted me pretty good.
But it must have been something more than an imprint. One always wonders whether a successful writer, and one like yourself who's taught writing as well, what those influences were, what the contact with literature, the love of literature that must have been imprinted fairly early, and imprinted in the sense that it was not just rote to be memorized.
Oh, yes, I think so. Partly that's, again, a product of deprivation. If you have only 3 books, books are of great interest to you. If you have 12, they still remain of great interest. There was no library in that town, and nobody in the town had any books except, you know, odds and ends of this and that. We had a set of Shakespeare and a few George Barr McCutcheon novels and things like that.
And it was thoroughly read, I suppose.
I read past History of the World, and I read them all by the time I was 7 or 8, yeah. And I read every book in town that I could borrow. That's true of all the children in town who had any liking for books at all. So I think probably I was just as well off as if I'd had a Carnegie Public Library at hand. I didn't read the books that might have done me the most good, but I certainly got the impulse to read books.
What about the values with which you grew up? It's been said of you that you revere traditional values. It's reflected certainly in your books that I've read. Did you grow up with rigid values?
No, I grew up in a family which was, as I said, a family of drifters. My father never finished the 8th grade. My mother never finished the 6th. She had, I think, a considerable cultural potential, which was never realized because she simply had to take care of her family after her mother died when she was about 14. My father, on the other hand, was a kind of folklore figure. He was full of it. You make what you can of it, and if you grow up in that atmosphere of deprivation on a frontier, without history, without architecture, I never saw a building any more impressive than a grain elevator until I saw my first lawn. I think probably you get the habit of trying to catch up with civilization. And I've been trying to catch up with civilization all my life, not to make a new one, not to live experimentally, but to get competent to live with the one that exists.
How do you catch up with civilization?
You don't. I've been an anachronism all my life.
I see.
I'm a 19th century character, you see. And I'm not sure that's entirely bad, because I watch the young trying to live experimentally, and I'm not sure that works.
You didn't have to do it experimentally. It was real.
No, I was trying to catch up with Alfred Lord Tennyson and people like that.
Wally, the family moved to Utah when I guess you were in your teens, and here, once again, the parallel is drawn between you and Bernard DeVoto, and the story you tell of Bernard DeVoto's life in Utah, since he was not a Mormon, did not belong to the Mormon society, but as a matter of fact was antagonistic toward it, and that helped to shape his character. You too were not Mormon, I judge, but I gather did not have the same attitude toward your environment.
I was nothing. You see, Benny was half Catholic, and the Catholic tradition took over, and he was educated as a Catholic and baptized as a Catholic and so on. It never took, but he had a kind of Catholic background. I had no background at all. I was not only without history, I was without religion. Though I made 7 years of little merit badges for never missing Sunday school in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, that never took either. I didn't feel myself affiliated with any religion, and so I probably had a better time in Utah than Benny did. I didn't have to be hostile to it. I went on, joined the Boy Scouts in the Mormon wards and played basketball in Mormon ward leagues and all that. I was around the ward as much as if I'd been Mormon, but you know, I never went to church. I just went Tuesday nights. That's when the amusement went on, and the MIA, so-called. And I think probably I have warmer and happier memories of Utah than Benny ever had. In fact, I think of Utah really as a kind of home. It was very good to me. I went to high school and college there, and I liked all of it. And I like Salt Lake, and I like the state of Utah, and I go back there every chance I get. Benny had so many scars from having been the homely Catholic boy, the one who went to a Catholic girls' school, the only boy in a girls' school, who was always brighter than the people around him and never quite sure that it showed, so that he made it show more than it ought to show. And he had a kind of grudge fight going with the city of Ogden from the time he was 5 years old on. And of course he was precocious in curious ways, which I was not. His father had him reading at the age of 3, maybe 2. Nobody quite knows how early he read, but he was reading Tasso, Orlando Furioso, and things like that before he was 10, while I was reading, what was I reading at that point? Nedra or The Rock in the Baltic, or some of my mother's popular novels.
And of course, Benny looked upon Ogden, Utah as a cultural desert as a consequence of his exposure to
Sure, well, I
kind
looked
of
upon it as getting to the big time, you see. But compared to what I had in the past, Salt Lake City was a great and sophisticated place. 3 or 4 movie houses.
And grass.
I went to my first concert in the Salt Lake Tabernacle, and it was John Philip Sousa and his band. Shook me up for weeks.
Never heard anything like that before.
Never did, no.
You went to the University of Utah. Had you any intention at that time of becoming a writer or a teacher?
I suppose that, no, not when I started, but very shortly after I got there, I found that I seemed to have a knack of words, and my freshman English instructor, who was a novelist named Vardis Fisher, of whom you may have heard,
Oh, yes.
picked me out and put me in an advanced class, and I suppose that sort of imprimatur starts you on a track. And I was trying to write stories while I was in college, and I won some little college contest, and my story was published in the Salt Lake Telegram or someplace. I was a published author.
And that was the encouragement necessary to...
Yeah, and then by
someone
accident
started.
I went to Iowa, which was establishing a writer's program, and when I found that I
Was that by accident?
That was by the accident of having got a fellowship there, yeah. When I got there, I found Norman Foerster was establishing a writing program, and so I fell into that with great happiness.
You've referred to yourself as a guinea pig in this program. Apparently it was a fairly early program in creative writing.
It was the first one, so far as I know, in the colleges. Foerster was against literary scholarship and for a more creative kind of education. And he encouraged everybody who could to write, tried to be discriminating about it. I think we were probably the first MAs in creative writing, so-called, in the United States. Paul Engel and I and 2 or 3 others took those degrees. Then after that, when the Depression continued, and there weren't any jobs, and the safest place to stay was in school. Most of us went on and took degrees in, more orthodox American literature, so, because they were better teaching certificates.
Mm-hmm. And teaching was in your mind at this time, of course.
Teaching was about the only thing I could do at that point. I had worked my way through college selling rugs and linoleum, but I didn't want to sell rugs and linoleum all my life.
Mm-hmm. And you went on to teach then when you finished with your PhD?
I went back to teach at the University of Utah a year before I finished my degree. I came back in the summer, finished the degree, and then stayed at Utah 3 years, and then wrote my first book and got delusions of grandeur, and had a fight with the president because he wouldn't promote me, and quit and went abroad and came back and took a job finally, rather tamely, at the University of Wisconsin.
So you've written and taught at the same time for a good many years now, and you've been able to combine these careers, and as a matter of fact have said that there's no reason why they ought not to be combined.
Well, I think if you have enough energy so that you have some for sale, that's perfectly feasible, particularly if the university is reasonable and relatively kind to you, as Harvard and Stanford were to me. Then you can do it. You can schedule your classes for the afternoon and read the papers at night and have the mornings free. But it means you moonlight all your life and you work a long day, and it's 7 days a week.
In the 25 years that you headed the creative writing program at Stanford, teaching others to write, what conclusions did you come to about what can and cannot be taught? Is writing something that is a compulsion, inherited compulsion, or is it a learned craft, or a combination of both?
Well, it's a combination. Certainly, I have come to the conclusion. I'm a little bit like Theodore Dreiser, at an advanced age, saying, "Sadly, I go, knowing less than I came knowing." I think probably there's no point in teaching people who don't have a noticeable gift. Often there's no point in teaching people who do have a noticeable gift if they don't have those qualities of character or neurosis or whatever it is that keep them at it.
What is
if
the
they
gift?
can be stopped, they'll stop.
What is the gift?
The gift is partly of the senses. I think it's basically a gift of the senses, a gift of observing, and also, I suppose this is William James' doctrine, the gift of quick association, so that one thing suggests another and things go together to become something new in the head. I'm not a psychologist, and you better not follow my formula, but I think it has to do with senses in the first instance, and then it has to do with the gift of words. A lot of writers have been writers of some consequence, however, without the gift of words, Dreiser being one. He just comes over you like a tank, leaving his tread tracks in your lawn, and he clanks and grinds and so on, but he does tear up your lawn, all right. And he never wrote a good sentence in his life. Not a one, I think.
So how do you measure good fiction then?
I think the measure should be, nothing that one person defines. I can tell you the kind of fiction that I like. That's about the best I could do. And the kind of fiction that I like is a kind of fiction which is not only perceptive, and which has people in it who are plausible people, and which has some relation to real life.
It's important to you that it do relate to real people.
Oh, yes, I'm a realist. I never get over that. I told you I was a 19th century character. I don't know what it's about unless it's about real life. I don't see any point in turning real life upside down unless what you're doing gives you a better look at real life, like looking at a view through your spraddled legs. That's all right. I don't mind that. But the ultimate thing is that illusion of reality and some kind of commentary on reality. So I would guess that anybody who has something to say about reality, who can say it in memorable ways, is going to appeal to me. And sometimes they get away with it even if they can't say it in memorable ways. If they have, as Dreiser had, every gift of the novelist except the verbal gift. He's a great feeler. He knows how people feel in situations, and he is structurally a man who can build bridges. They reach from here to there. They go from bank to bank. But I guess if I were picking the kinds of people that I like best, what is good fiction. I would pick people like Chekhov and Conrad and Turgenev. I seem to be very Slavic about
Yes.
it. Those are the people I'd take to my desert island if I had to take some. Three.
And good fiction should teach us something about ourselves, I suppose. Give us an insight, at least, into why we
I
are
think
as we
so.
are.
All of those people in their way are moralists, although Turgenev is so obscurely a moralist because he feared the censors, or had to work under the censors, that you have to interpret him
Are
for
you a
yourself.
moralist, Wally? You've
Oh, I
referred to
think so.
yourself as an aging Puritan in one context.
Yeah, I don't see anything wrong with being a Puritan. I rather get belligerent about it, in fact. Yeah, I'm a moralist. Not that I want fiction to be didactic, not that I want it to preach, but I think it has to take a position. And sometimes those fictions which don't take a position or which deliberately turn things upside down for black humor effects and so on, those are not my kind. I think they're often very clever, but I think they're ultimately empty.
I wanted to ask you one brief question about another of your overriding interests, that in conservation. You've been very active in conservationist activities for some time now.
Less active sometimes than I wanted to be, because when you're moonlighting, you don't always have the
Right,
time.
but you are deeply concerned. And in 1969, I'm pulling a quotation out of an article you wrote, you said, "It is very late, but if we are not at the brink of a Spenglerian decline, we could be on the brink of the greatest period of human history." Now, that was several years ago that you said that. Have you any reason for optimism about being on the brink of a greater
You mind
period?
if I take that all back?
You don't feel that way today?
I can't feel that since 1969 the world has, or the United States or the world, has turned very noticeably up. I should say just the reverse. On the other hand, I'm not absolutely pessimistic about it either, because the very fact that we make this much fuss about corruption, the very fact that we try this hard to prepare a better world, means to me that we might ultimately come out at 51%, which, as Benny DeVoto said, is in your favor. At least you can live with it.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.